Okay, so there's actually a lot of symbolism in this monument that a casual observer in the Louvre would not necessarily pick up on unless they had read something about Mesopotamian culture. For example, I mean, there's things that are very obvious, and then there are things that are less obvious. So, an obvious thing would be that Naram-Sin's musculature is well defined. I mean, he's pretty buff, especially when you compare him to Eonatum of Lagash, right? Let me just see if I could find. Yeah, here we go. Right, here's poor Eonatum. Not so much, right? But yeah, and this seems to many people to be a fairly obvious way of portraying the king, as a god, as a very, very masculine individual, because that would make him seem like a stronger leader in the eyes of all the people. Many times also scantily clad or lightly clad people or lightly clad individuals are gods. So that's another sort of symbol of his divineness here. You could see the horn helmet and also the beard. Right? So from this point on, you see it a little bit in the early dynastic, but really it's very important in the Akkadian period, and we're going to see it continue throughout Mesopotamian history. Kings like to portray themselves with long, flowing, well-groomed beards, right? That it's sort of a testament to their masculinity. He's also showing us his right side. Right? His right side is exposed, and that's symbolic as well in Mesopotamian culture. In divinations, right? It says if the right side is deformed in any way, it portends ill for the country and the ruler. If the ruler's right side is damaged, it's a bad omen for not just the ruler, but the entire country. Right? So it's a lot like later European kings who would say, I am the state, or I am England, right? That is the state, the empire, and the emperor or the king are one and the same. The health of the king equates to the health of the land and the health of the country. If no right ear, the days of the prince will be at an end. If no right form or hand, the outlying districts would become wasteland, right? So Irene Winter thinks that Naram-Sin had to show the viewer, right, that the right ear was there, the right limbs were perfectly formed. Okay, the beard, again, as we said, is an important symbol. We know that in later times, Assyrians will rob their enemies of their vitality by cutting their beards off. Right? We also, Irene Winter believes that there's kind of an alluring quality to the way he's depicted, right? With a little bit of his gluteus maximus exposed over there, right? And it's, so it's supposed to be what we would call today sexy, right? He's supposed to be a virile, attractive person. And so you can see that from his grandfather, Sargon, to Naram-Sin, there is a leap forward in terms of the art. We can see kind of a progression, but it started with Sargon, this kind of more realistic depiction, more musculature shown. So many times in cylinder seals and other works of art, heroes like Gilgamesh and Enkidu are usually depicted either nude or scantily clad. Naram-Sin also took another title, Danum, which means strong one. And here you could also see the horn helmets that, again, indicate divinity. Right? A later Syrian ruler, Adad-nirari II, relates that The gods altered my stature to lordly stature, made perfect my features, and filled my lordly body with wisdom, and surrounded my head with the aura of rulership. Right. So again, the Ramsin is trying to give himself this quality of perfection. And it sort of relates a little bit, or a kind of an interesting example would be, from the 1940s and 50s. I'm sure you've seen those comic book ads, the old comic book ads of Charles Atlas, where the guy's getting sand kicked in his face. He's got a girlfriend there, and the girlfriend ends up going with the bully. The guy goes back home and says, I'm writing for Charles Atlas workout program, which is this over here, and would use all sorts of exercise in his room, gets really, really strong, goes back to the beach and punches the bully out. I'm sure you've seen that. It's interesting because Charles Atlas, he was kind of this workout king in the 40s and 50s. A lot of people at that time knew exactly who he was. There's actually a statue of George Washington in New York in Washington Square Park, where George Atlas served as the model for the sculptor who was creating that sculpture of George Washington. So it's a little bit of sort of the same thing. Or some people relate it to the movie. It's not that old yet, I think, right? You couldn't call it a classic yet. I think 2006 or something. 300 with the Spartans, where they're pretty much scantily clad the entire movie. And, they're supposed to look like super buff superhumans. I mean that's part of the film, basically, right? So it's a similar sort of depiction. We see it in artwork, depicting especially classical times. The classical Greeks did a similar thing. And the opposite is true, right? So depicting your enemy as deformed was sort of a way of saying that they, in some way, were illegitimate in terms of their right to rule, or they couldn't be strong because they had some sort of deformation. An example of that in history would be Richard III. Who did have a slight curvature of the spine. Once they found his skeleton in England, they dug it up not that long ago, found it under what they call in England a car park, a parking lot. But Shakespeare, of course, depicted Richard III as this, deformed hunchback. And this was a sort of another swipe at Richard III because, of course, during Shakespeare's time, the Tudor kings are ruling, and the Tudors defeated Richard III to take back the throne. So, of course, they're not going to depict Richard III in a positive light. Some people even today believe that Richard III kind of got the short end of the stick here, that Shakespeare really exaggerated any kind of problem he had in order to make him appear less of a king, but during his time he was respected, and people thought much of him, and that curvature of the spine was not a big issue. There's a lot of debate about that, and one of the things that I want you to do for the discussion board is to come up with some sort of comparable example in history or in the present day of a leader who has some sort of monument of themselves, depicting themselves in a certain way to create or convey a certain message. Or it could be a depiction of a leader that the leader does not have created for them. The leader, let's say, has already passed on, and this is a memorial to that person. But there's some debate, let's say, as to how that person should be depicted, and exactly, should they be standing, should they be sitting, what kind of expression should they have on their face, that kind of thing. There's been recent controversy about that in the U.S. Capitol. Of course, there's lots you could also talk about with Confederate monuments, how Confederates are depicted, the reaction to those monuments. You can see that a lot of those monuments, like the Ramsin Sargon's monument, were destroyed in ancient times, were defaced at some point. And it's a little bit like what's going on with monuments to Confederate officers and soldiers, right? So monuments matter. It's there's still a similar thing going on today. Who are we creating statues of? Where are we putting these statues? And what message are we sending to people today? And if you haven't followed it, there's a big controversy about Confederate statue in Allendale, of all places, right? There's actually a part of their war memorial, if you've been following it, has soldiers of different U.S. wars. And for the Civil War, there's a Union soldier. There's also a Confederate soldier. And there's a kneeling African-American black child reaching for what's supposed to be the Emancipation Proclamation or something like that. So it looks like it actually looks like a strange sort of monument compared to the other ones. But there's a lot of people who would like the Confederate soldier removed, and there's been kind of a lot of resistance by some people, and it's turned into a little bit of a controversy, you could say. And that's something that you might want to bring up or think about as you're posting your discussion post. So just sort of a way of showing that these things from ancient times still have obviously a lot of parallels to society today. There's also some comparison to Gilgamesh, right, in the way that Naram-Sin is depicted. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you remember that scene right before he meets up with Inanna, where he's washing and bathing himself. Gilgamesh washed out his long locks and cleaned his weapons. He flung back his hair from his shoulders, kind of like Fabio, if you know who Fabio is. He threw off his stained clothes and changed them for new. He put on his royal robes and made them fast. When Gilgamesh had put on the crown, glorious Ishtar lifted her eyes. Seeing the beauty of Gilgamesh, she said, "Come to me, Gilgamesh, and be my bridegroom. Grant me seed of your body. Let me be your bride, and you shall be my husband." And of course, he rejects her, as you know from the poem. But the way Naram-Sin is depicted, it almost looks like he just flung his hair back, put on a new robe, and is about to be courted by Inanna. And later kings who consider themselves to be divine, as we'll see, talk about having a relationship with Inanna. So, was this stela on display in the temple courtyard again? Who had access? Who was the audience? Was this using kind of this sense of masculinity for political purposes? Did it sort of reinforce gendered conceptions of identity? These are some of the things that people want to tackle when they discuss this stela. It's a very important work of art. If you take an art history class, I would not be surprised if you study this stela, because it as we saw, was kind of a breakthrough monument. Okay, what does the later inscription say? Well, it talks about the taking of the monument. So I am Shurut-Nahute, son of Halutush in Shushniak, beloved servant of the god in Shushniak, king of Anshan and Susa, enlarger of my realm, protector of Elam, prince of Elam. At the command of the god, I struck down the city of Sipar, which is in southern Mesopotamia. I took the stela of Naram-Sin in my hand. I carried it off and brought it back to Elam. I set it up in dedication to my Lord. Right. So sort of not only are they taking it as a trophy and a prize, they're also inscribing on it to show what they had done. So there's a strong connection between art and ideology and the attempt to influence people to memorialize one's accomplishments in artwork. And so we see further examples of that in Naram-Sin's reign, and we see that continuing throughout Mesopotamian history with stamps on bricks that are used for large building projects. So if a new temple was being constructed, from this point on, leaders will have the bricks stamped with their name and what they're doing, building the temple of so-and-so. so that it's preserved for posterity. Right? So this particular brick stamp, right, you can see that there's that dinger or on symbol that indicates that what comes next is the name of a god. And it spells out Na-Ra-M. Then over here is another dinger symbol, because what comes next is Su-N, right? And Su-N is the Akkadian version of Sin, right? Which is the Semitic name for Nana, right? So Nana is the Sumerian, and Sin is the Akkadian name for the moon god, right? So what his name means is, Naram means beloved, Sin, of the moon god Sin, right? So he has to have the on symbol here because the name of the god is here. So it's the divine symbol for the first part and the divine symbol for the second part. So he has two of those, right? Because his name actually means beloved of the moon god Sin. So it's really, God Naram, God Suen. And then it says Ba'dim, builder, right? So some of these, when you see these inscriptions in the museum, I think you'll be able to easily pick out the on symbol that means divinity, right? It looks like an asterisk. You'll easily recognize that. Another one that you'll probably recognize is this kind of checkerboard thing that means house, or A, right? And if you see a brick or brick stamp in a museum, you know that it's someone memorializing the construction of some building. So not surprisingly, it has A for building, and then it has again the symbol meaning that the name of a god is coming, and it's Enlil, right, who was the main god of ancient Mesopotamia. So basically putting his name on the bricks, saying, Naram Sin, the builder of the temple of the god Enlil. Okay, and while they didn't stamp bricks, they did have dedication monuments like this in the early dynastic. So here's one before the Akkadian period, and you can see that, what we're used to in terms of Sumerian art. This is a king or Nanshe. The Akkadians do not depict themselves. The Akkadian kings do not depict themselves like this, but you're going to see this is very much a Sumerian stylistic convention. Kings involved in building projects, or kings who are commemorating building projects, they depict themselves carrying a load of bricks on their head, a basket of bricks, getting ready to actually build that building. So in the period right after the Akkadian Empire, we're going to be talking about that next week, kings depict themselves in the Sumerian style. This is a bronze statuette that would be buried in the foundations of a temple. So it would be only for the god, really. No one would see it, but commemorating that king had that temple constructed and the king carrying a basket of bricks. So we have inscriptions from these Akkadian kings, right, on bricks. We also have, this is a stone bowl, part of the lute from Magan, dedicated to the moon god Sin at Ur, right, by the daughter of the later king Shulgi, right? So this was, dedicated. You can see here, and here you'll notice Naram Sin's name. Okay, so let's look at some other features of the Akkadian Empire. The Akkadian Empire is really at its height under Naram Sin. Naram Sin ushers in a series of new conventions. And so really, when we're talking about the Akkadian system at its height, we're really talking about the period of Naram Sin. Okay, so one of the things we've already mentioned, and that reaches its apex kind of under Naram Sin, is refinement of Akkadian art, right? This sort of emphasis of naturalism. Some people don't like the term realistic because the people and the animals are still stylized. They don't look exactly like what they do in nature, but certainly they're more detailed, and it's more natural than the Sumerian artwork, right? So here's a Sumerian cylinder seal from the royal tomb of Ur, and here's an Akkadian cylinder seal of a scribe who worked for a later Akkadian king. Right? And there's kind of new conventions rather than feasting scenes, which you see in the early dynastic. Early dynastic has a lot of these feasting scenes. We saw it on the seal of Pu-Abi. A lot of the seals during the Akkadian period have these kinds of gods depicted or heroes wrestling with animals, these kind of contest scenes. In this depiction here, what you have are these water buffalo, which are not native to Mesopotamia. They come from the Indus Valley in India. And so this is, again, showing the trade that existed between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley at this time. Right? There's also, as you can see here with the the early dynastic seal, there's not really a balance or a symmetry to the art. Whereas in the Akkadian depiction, you can see that there's very much kind of a balance and a pairing, right? And so it's sort of new artistic conventions. We saw that bust that might be Sargon earlier. Well, there's another bust, a bronze bust that was found by archaeologists of an Akkadian ruler. We don't know exactly who, but you can see the way that Akkadian kings were depicting themselves, long flowing beards, the hair wrapped up in this turban, kind of a peaceful, serene look, but also more realistic depiction. The artistic skill increased, obviously, at this time. You can also see it with this statue from the time period of Naram-Sin, this Basekti statue. We think that the copper to make the statue probably came from Oman, which was the main source during this particular time period. This remnants of the statue was about 350 pounds in weight. Showing that they are able to get quite a lot of this copper from that Gulf region. You can see it's only partially complete. Right? It was probably some deity sort of sitting around a tree. It's very realistic compared to a lot of the other art. You can see a very sort of relaxed pose in terms of the legs, not stiff and rigid and standing up straight. And it's almost like later Greek art that, you don't see until 500 BC, until almost 2,000 years later. This is a depiction of an Akkadian ruler. Some people think Manishtushu, found in the northern Mesopotamian city of Assur. And again, you can see, how well defined the features are, as well as in these depictions of women that you can see here. Okay, one thing that I like to harp on with many of my students in understanding empires is I like to say there are a lot of things that make empires work, but the things I like to stress are centralization of power, and the other is standardization, right? New conventions and also streamlining of administration. And the Akkadians excelled at this, especially under Naram-Sin. Right? So one thing that they start that we know about from the Sumerian kings list is there's sort of years. Each year is getting a name. The name is usually like the year so-and-so did this, right? The year King Shar-Kali-Sharli campaigned against Sumer in the mountains. The year he built this temple of Enlil. But every year is being accounted for, and it's being given a name. So it's kind of setting up a convention of keeping track of the events, the main events of each year for a king. So it's sort of a new way of record keeping that is important. There's also an increase in administration, right? So we can see from some of the administrative texts that are found that these royal officials were keeping track of labor and agricultural products, right? And they were also responsible for supplying the governor's palace, let's say, in that city or in that province, and also the city temple. So it looked like, or it looks like, appears from the text that the bureaucracy functions rather well. There are also inspectors. These are people who are loyal to the king throughout the empire, who are watching out for his interests and reporting back to the king. And we get sort of only one side of it. We get a few tablets from some of these other cities or provinces, where maybe a royal inspector is talking about a shipment of goods that they sealed to go back to the heartland of southern Mesopotamia, for example. But because we don't have the capital city of Agad, we don't have what could exist, the main archive of tablets that would give us obviously a lot of information. There are also military garrisons placed in these kind of forts in the provinces to keep control of the local population, maybe to help with tax and tribute collection, to protect trade routes and traders, right? And also to conquer new territory if needed. Another thing that the Akkadians did, which was important, was they standardized weights. As we said, they also standardized calendars, right? But the weight system, and here we can see again, this is without that dinger symbol at the beginning of his name, but here's Naram-Sin's name, and the symbol for Lugal or Shar in Akkadian, king, right? This is in the shape of a duck, with the duck's head resting on the back of its wings. Before this time, every single city-state had its own system of weights. So that made trade very difficult. It would be, a lot like traveling in Europe. In the old days when they still had pounds and Deutschmarks and lira, etc., right? Because you have to convert the prices all the time. One of the first things they did when they formed the European Union was to standardize the currency into one currency system, the euro. Okay, England kept their pound system. Now, obviously, they left the European Union, but that made actually transactions a little bit tricky for some people when dealing with people in England, because sometimes people, it depended on the business, sometimes they won things in pounds and not in euros, right? Obviously, it makes it complicated. If everyone has the same weight system in ancient times, it makes trade that much easier. It looks like they're also beginning to standardize the size of silver coils that we know in later times are used as essentially a kind of currency throughout ancient Mesopotamia, right? It's not what we're used to. We're used to coinage, but that doesn't appear until about 500 BC. Before what we would call money, right? Currency, coins that were stamped with a leader's head on them, you had rings of silver, and you would break off a certain unit, certain weight of silver, and use that to pay for certain goods. So sometimes people, if they went to the market, they would have, kind of these coils of silver and they could separate the coils. They could break off the wire at a certain point to pay for something. One of the interesting things about silver typically is used a lot for trade and for currency throughout the world, rather than gold. And it's kind of an interesting reason. Gold is rarer and it's more precious, but that's also part of the problem, right? That is, it's too rare to actually flow through the system. You need something that is valuable, but that there's more of it, so it actually can serve as a medium of exchange, and silver fits that description perfectly. Okay, so the other impact that this would have, standardizing weights and measures, the year dates and things like that, it would sort of reinforce a new ideology, right, through communal practice. It would be a little bit like changing who is on the currency, right? And when they take Andrew Jackson off of the $20 bill and they put Harriet Tubman on there, will it change things? It might, right? I mean, as people start handling the money, they're looking at it, they're realizing there's something new, right? So it sort of indicates that there's a new administration, or there's a change in the culture, or change in some sort of dynamic. And, then that person, kids love looking at money, and it becomes obviously something to teach history and things like that. And so by having year dates in the, sort of year 5 of the ruler blank, and, going to the marketplace and using this new weight system, it is a way of sort of ushering in a change. Okay, as we said before, I've actually said too many times, we don't have the capital city of Agad. So that's a completely missing piece of the puzzle. But what do we have? We do have excavations in northern Mesopotamia, in what's now Syria, a place called Tel Brak and Tel Leilan, dating from the Akkadian period. These were places that were conquered by the Akkadians. And we have evidence of new administration being set up there. So let's take a little look at what was found in these 2 cities.